Yeah, thank you for reading that out. I think we are in such a predicament. We in the middle of the war, we cannot really think about anything else. So it has to be linked. Everything has to be linked to the war. The way we live, the way we carry for our business, the way we are going to organize the societies now, all going to happen now. So anyway, I think the slide has come up. That was extempo. So I would now primarily uh, discuss about the paradox in a way that it is very commonsensical for us to think that when there is an abundance of resources, there's less conflict. But I would go against that motion to argue that no, it is not. Uh, by the way, the abundance of resources creates more conflict. So we will see that how it is getting established as we go through the presentation. Uh, and there's an abstract which I put forward, which must have in your hand, in everyone's hand. The scarcity doesn't always cause war. The valuable abundance does. So the abundance of the resources is not always available to high consumption societies. So I just kind of run through, if I can go to the next slide. So then I would match my content to that slide. If I can have the slide 2, please. The next slide, yeah. Yeah. No, that's slide 3.
So you want
I want
slide 2.
Yeah,
okay.
plus, yeah. So I have so when we examine the history of the human civilization, the dominant narrative is often one of expansion, conquest, and the constant push for more. However, tucked away in the world's most demanding environments are the societies that mastered the art of a steady state existence. So these are the minimalist societies which have always existed in this world and that have always learned to live within their means. These minimalist cultures thrive not by outgrowing their surroundings, but by deeply integrating into them. By prioritizing the ecological balance over territorial gain, they prove that a high quality life is possible without the need for external foraging on imperialist growth. The San people of the Kalahari Desert serve as one of the most enduring examples of this philosophy. Having lived in the Southern Africa for tens, thousands of years, they developed a social structure that actively suppressed the human urge to accumulate surplus. Now, we talk about a society is always about surplus. Here, we talk about a degrowth society which is without surplus. Very interesting. So, in this Sans culture, the concept of living within one's means is enforced through egalitarianism. For instance, the practice of insulting the meat ensures that a successful hunter remains humble and the resources are distributed based on communal need rather than individual power. So, by maintaining a low density population and a highly mobile lifestyle within a defined seasonal range, they avoided the resource depletion that typically drives a society to invade the neighboring lands. So, in the high altitude deserts of Ladakh, India, the traditional social fabric was woven specifically to withstand extreme scarcity. The Ladakhi people created a remarkably sophisticated closed loop system where every ounce of the organic matter was recycled back into the thin Himalayan soil. Their minimalist approach was not just environmental, but structural. Social custom historically helped regulate the population to match the carrying capacity of the land. The Little Tibet uh, functioned for centuries as self-contained unit where wealth was measured by socially resilience and leisure time rather than acquisition of the new territories, creating a culture profound contentment in one of these most resource-poor regions on earth. So even in the modern context, now this about the Ladakhi, I must say that they do not live in an insular position. So there is continuous exchange. People are coming into their land, but they still have managed to live within their means. So even in this modern context, groups like the Amis have deliberately fenced in their growth to maintain a sustainable community scale by rejecting technologies that would allow them to expand their geographic reach, such as the cars or the high-speed machinery. They effectively try their survival to health of their immediate social ecosystem, local ecosystem. Their self-imposed limitation prevents the geographic sprawl that defines most modern economies. So similarly, the ancient Polynesian islanders developed a kapu or a taboo system which functioned as a spiritual or a legal framework to prevent overfishing and deforestation. These societies understood a fundamental truth that modern growth based on economics often ignored on a finite planet. The only way to ensure long-term survival is to treat the territory you have as a spaceship with limited precious cargo. You have already a spaceship which just come back, and we know that how the people in a space station or in a spaceship live within their means. What is the historic logic of the enough? Historically, the minimalist societies operated on the principle of optimal foraging theory, which suggests that a group will only expand its territory if the energy gained from the new land exceeds the energy spent defending it. Groups like San or Ladakhi realized early on that more often meant more risk. To stay within their means, they utilize social leveling mechanisms. If someone tried to hoard resources or push for expansion, the community used storytelling or gift sharing requirements to bring that individual back into alignment. This historical minimalism was essentially a sophisticated risk management system. By needing very little, they became nearly impossible to bankrupt or starve. So what is their influence on modern minimalism? The modern minimalism, which often seen today as an aesthetic of the white walls and expensive decluttering, has deep roots in these ancient social practices. The simple living movement of the 20th or 21st century draws directly from the steady state logic of, of these ancestral groups. Now, in this modern thing, of course, there are some people like the theorists, like the modern proponents like Duan Elgin. He has a movement called the small house. And that mirrors on the Ladakhi philosophy. They argue that by reducing our physical footprint, we gain a surplus of time and a psychological freedom. So this reflects the ancient tribal view that the wealth is found in the quality of one's relationships rather than the quantity of one's possessions. Now, what is the regenerative design and the permaculture? Now, the Polynesians' Kapu system, which I mentioned sometime back in the above paragraph, and the closed loop farming of the Himalayans are the direct ancestors of the modern permaculture. Now, today's eco-minimalists attempt to replicate these homeostasis models by building tiny homes with compositing toilets and rainwater collection, effectively trying to live as islands within the large expansionist society. Now, in the anti-growth, and which we know as degrowth, there is a growing economic school of thought called the degrowth that looks to minimalist societies as proof that human well-being doesn't require a rising GDP. Now, the whole world obviously is going anti-GDP now, and therefore there are obvious reasons because there are various other economic measurements are coming into form, which are more appropriate and serving the human societies really well. So these economists study how these ancient groups maintain stable populations and high levels of social capital without ever needing to forage into other markets or territories. So now there is a shift from survival to the choice. So the primary difference lies in intent. For the San or the Ladakhi, living within their means was a non-negotiable reality of their environment. For modern minimalists, it is a rebellious choice against a global closure of excess. However, both groups share the same core realizations. The territorial expansion, whether literal or metaphorical market share, eventually leads to a loss of community cohesion and the environmental collapse. By reclaiming the ancient territory of the self, modern minimalists hope to find the same stability that allowed these historical society to last for millennia. Now, if I can go to the next slide, please, that is war as a business model. Here I would like to know, and particularly like to focus on the current context, that in contrast to these minimalist societies that lived within their means, the history of the empire building is derived by extractive economies, the process of seizing the land and the wealth from other territories to fuel your growth at home. So calculating a total loot is complex, as it involves centuries of raw materials, labor, precious metals. However, historians have provided staggering estimates for the largest colonizers of the world. I'm sure that you all can hazard a guess that the biggest colonizer, of course, the British Empire, which at its peak in the 1920s, the British Empire was the largest in the history, and famously described the empire in which the sun never sets. And you would be surprised to know that it was spreading over a 35.5 million square kilometers, which is 25.4%, approximately about a 1/4 of the Earth's total land area. The resources, those were looted, and you may choose to have a less pejorative term called looted, whatever way you want to say. The financial wealth, the landmark study by the economist Utsa Patnaik, and it's supported by Oxfam data, suggests that the British extracted nearly about a 45 trillion to 64 trillion from India alone between 1765 and 1938. Now, 64 trillion, which would mean that twice the size of the current US economy. Now, the commodities, which were massive quantities of cotton, tea, spices, and opium, now used to balance the trade deficits with China. And you know about the Great Opium War, which happened, and what the consequence of that war, and also the precious stones. Now, the Mongol Empire, which comes next, while not a colonial empire in the maritime sense, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire, primarily through rapid territorial seizure. They spread themselves over 24 million square kilometers from Hungary to China. And the resources they looted, a tribute to destruction model, is not only of the gold, but the seizure of the human capital. They forcibly relocated thousands of skilled artisans, engineers, and scholars to the Mongol capital. Now, then next came, of course, the Spanish conquistadors, and we know their campaign in the Latin America. And that colonization focused primarily heavily on the extraction of the precious metal to fund the European wars and the golden age of the Spain. It was they were spreading themselves over 13.7 million kilometers. And then, of course, the resources they have looted, about 1,500 to 1,800, Spain extracted approximately about 150,000 metric tons of silver from Latin America. So, of course, there is gold, there are agricultural products, etc. The French, they were not too far, spreading themselves over 11.5 million square kilometers, and they all started from mineral, industrial goods to tax systems. So, of course, Russians I left out. Russian, of course, they are with about a landmass, spreading over a landmass about 22.8 million square kilometers, and they're there. Of course, there are two dynasties of the China. China always seems to be a self-contained empire, but it's not really, except that two empires, which two exceptions was the Qing and the Yuan dynasty. And they were spreading themselves over about a 14.7 million square kilometers. So, and then, of course, the caliphates came, the Umayyads and Abbasids, and then, of course, they were over about 11.1. Then the Portuguese Empire, about 10.4 million square kilometers. Saying these, Dutch and Belgians are not too far. Belgians, primarily, we know about that the death in which was currently the Democratic Republic of Congo, earlier the Congolian Free State, where the King Leopold treated the Congo as a kind of a private resource. So he famously, that not many people died elsewhere, probably due to this campaign. There are more people died in this planet because of the King Leopold too. So talking about all these, what it means is that that is an economic calculus of rebellion. So war is now constantly weaponized as a business model. So the traditional view of the war is as a failure of diplomacy is increasingly challenged by the reality of the war business model. In the regions like the DRC, which I mentioned, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the armed groups such as the March 23rd movement, M23 it is known, do not merely fight for political ideology, they operate as sophisticated economic entities. Now, these groups perform a cold financial calculation. If the expected rent capture, the wealth that gained from controlling mines and the trade routes, that's called the rent capture, exceeds the cost of hiring mercenaries and purchasing weapons, then conflict becomes a rational economic choice. So in this framework, mercenaries and standing armies are not just military assets, but the necessary business expenditure required to sustain the lucrative trade in conflict minerals like cobalt and diamonds. Now, that is something always we talk about. There is an extractive economic versus the logic of enough. Now, in the modern market, is primarily fueled by an extractive economies, a legacy of the empire building where land and the wealth are seized from the external territories to fuel domestic growth. Now, this stands in a stark contrast to the minimalist society, which we discussed earlier, is that, which I mentioned earlier, is that the minimalist societies that have historically mastered the steady state existence. Now, where I mentioned about these, the Kalahari people, the son of the Kalahari, the Ladakis, the Little Tibet. And of course, one I probably left out is talking about the Tokugawa, Japan, where during the Edo period, the Japan managed extreme resource scarcity through advanced forest management and urban recycling, maintaining an internal peace for 250 years, despite having a massive hardened warrior class. Now, what is this geopolitical weaponization of the rents? While the rebel groups capture rents in civil wars, the modern states weaponize rents in geopolitical conflicts. High consumption societies such as the United States shape their domestic politics around the necessity of building the war chest to secure future resource access. This is particularly evident in this targeting of the choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz, which regulates about 20% of the global oil flows. Now, current conflicts often trigger not by the current scarcity, but by the expectation of the future scarcity. Now, this anticipation leads to unerring prolongation of the war as the nations seek to control the energy infrastructure, shipping routes, like the Iran oil fields, to influence the global prices and ensure their own long-term supply. Now, there is also always a hidden cost of this foraging, which we always miss out. The historical foraging onto other territories carries a profound internal cost of the aggression. The erosion of the home culture and the creation of a corrupting military-industrial complex. Now, look at the American Express. The occupation of Afghanistan cost America close to about 2.3 trillion US dollar and thousands of lives. And the Vietnam resulted over about 58,000 deaths and an economic loss of about 1 trillion in the current value. Now, you can understand, the scale of the loss. And the sustainability gap scale, to sustain the average American footprint of 8 global hectares, it would require 5 watts if replicated globally. Now, how would you live in such a high consumption society? So by contrasting these high consumption engines of growth with islands of stability like Switzerland and Bhutan, which I will talk in a while, it becomes clear that international peace is sabotaged by the very trade mechanism intended to unify the global market. Can you go to the next slide, please? The slide 4, please. Yeah, slide 4. Is that slide? Yeah. So in that case, it's 12 p.m. Yeah, that's the side flow. That's right. I've got it. Sure, thank you. So here we talk about the DRC. The scarcity doesn't always cause war. The valuable abundance does. The abundance resources is always available to high consumption society. Like in this case, they look beyond their territories, targeting the resource-rich countries and reduce them to civil conflicts. That exactly happened in DRC. These undesirable civil wars are sustained by the rebel groups and the warlords who become a part of the economic opportunity created by the consumer demand originating elsewhere. So whether it is demands in Sierra Leone, oil in Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, or cobalt in the DRC, the conflicts surrounding these resources can be structurally linked to the external consumption. So in their footprint, these resource hunting states have the affected, leave the affected colonized states in a state of disarray and disorder. So the connection of these, the M3, the March 23 movement, which I mentioned earlier, of the DRC and the legacy of the colonizer is a direct and a tragic illustration of how expansionist foraging into the territories create a long-term instability. While M3 officially formed in 2012, its existence is rooted in the colonial policies that fractured in the, the Great Lakes region of the Africa some century ago. So DRC is the most, so that is what I mean to say. The war becomes a business model, funding the weapons, paying the standing and the reserve army, and the mercenaries are regarded as necessary expenditure to sustain the business of violence and aggression. So war is not considered a failure of politics. It is putatively regarded as a rational response to a distorted economic incentives created by the global consumptions. So historically, DRC has been at the receiving end from many countries, starting from the colonizer Belgium, which still operates at large through companies such as Umicore, and or UAE's large gold export through the under-regulated trade flows, or even China's cobalt mining. DRC produces 70% of the world's cobalt supply, or US wide range of raw material extraction to sustain its industry of smartphones, EVs, electronic vehicles, computers, and IT infrastructure. Now, going to the next slide 5, which is the resource course and the conflict theory. Slide 5, please. From the perspective of the conflict theory, slide 5, From the perspective of the conflict theory, the countries consuming the most resources are often not where the conflict occurs, but they are where the demand originates. Now, Jeffrey Sachs and the Andrew Wan explain this phenomenon with a coined term called resource costs. Now, the countries dependent on the natural resource exports often face slower growth and higher corruption, which frequently boils over into a civil unrest and war. Now, I like to quote Paul Collier and the Ank Hoffler. They talk about how such gluttonous consumption creates a situation of resource rents, leading to conflict incentives. The extra profits from the natural resources are large in case where the extraction cost is low, such as DRC, and the global demand driven by the consumerism is high. An average American resource consumption in terms of ecological footprint is 8 global hectares in a year, far beyond the global sustainable level of 1.6 global hectare. To sustain this, it would require, as I mentioned, 5 Earths if everyone on this planet aspires to live like an American. So now, in terms of material, so I can go on an American, but I probably skip that just to come to the other very relevant points here. What happens in this process is that this shapes the domestic politics of high consumption societies such as America. Now, advocating to for building a war chest and projecting this to a geopolitical scenario, seeking war allies. Now, Darren Asmoglu and Mikhail Golosov point out the conflicts that spiral into the larger wars, which are strategically ways to be continued unabated. Now, according to them, it is not the current scarcity of the resources, it is the expectation of the future scarcity that triggers conflict. So the scarcity of the expectations leads to a strategic conflict and its honoring prolongations to an indefinite future. Now, Iran is targeted for its energy infrastructure, we all know, for oil, gas fields, shipping routes, and the de facto ownership of the Strait of Hormuz, the supply routes that targets about 20% of the global oil flows. Now, hence the ongoing US-Israeli relationship can be linked to the Collier-Hoffler's resource rents conflict incentives paradigm. So admittedly, the Persian Gulf is one of the richest hydrocarbon zones of the world, which controls massive oil fields. South Pars is the one, and the shipping choke points of the Hormuz. So the conflict thus has become economically meaningful. Ironically, this is for the Iran as well, from a geopolitical reign control perspective, as it influences supply, drives prices, and controls choke points. The takeaways from this, in the civil wars, a rebel captures rents, In geopolitical wars, states weaponize rents. Now, if you go to the next slide, which is this slide 6, talks about the consumption gap. We talk about the American footprint, but for why didn't they, for these countries, the historical turning point is usually a rationalization that the colonization carries a hidden cost, the erosion of the home culture. It is difficult to drive this point home for them. That is to say, for US, which still has not learned from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan experience to repeat this warmongering in Iran. After all, at least America was expected to take cognizance of Afghanistan, 20 years of occupation, which cost Uncle Sam, sorry about that, America, I would say, 2.3 trillion US dollars, and the deaths of some 2,500 military personnel and 1,800 American civilian contractors. During the Vietnam War, which lasted for 20 years between 1955 and 1975, a total of 58,000 plus US military personnel were recorded to have either died or declared missing in action. In the current value, the economic loss for the US was 1 trillion US dollar. Now, they must really, I must bring them to the attention of these minimalist societies like San and the Ladakhi, who aptly realize that the expansion creates social hierarchy and conflict. So these nations realize that maintaining an overseas empire or an invaded territory requires a massive, often corrupting military industrial complex. So the choice to be islands of stability rather than the engines of the growth. Can you go to the next slide? I just gone through very quickly, knowing that I've taken a little more time than my allocated time. So the geopolitical rent control. I keep on coming back to the rent control because that's somehow is a key terms I have used all through. The rebel groups in the Iran are too many. We have the Qadis, PJAK, we have the Baloch separatist group like Jais al-Ad. You have People's Mujahideen of Iran and the Komala Party of Iran Kurdistan. So further, the militias from the neighboring countries owing their allegiance to the Iran include the Hezbollah of Lebanon, the Houthis of Yemen, the Hamas in Gaza, the Syrian militia. All these players, all these groups admit to the unpleasant truth that the renting of the resources makes this conflict profitable, and the future insecurity over resources ensures the continuation of this conflict, enduringly unavoidable. So what I try to investigate is to establish a counterintuitive relationship between this hyper-consumerism and the global conflict. While increasing consumerism has fostered a world defined by globalization, interdependence, and interconnectedness, it simultaneously creates a systematic pressure that leads to war. The next slide, I only have 2 slides to go. The minimalist counter narrative that there is no scarcity of resources in these colonies. Yet they carried forward their campaign of the military conquest across geographies, pillaging, plundering as they expand their territories. These expansionist empires claimed they had to invade others to survive or grow. By the way, in the grand sweep of the history, these nations possess the means for conquest, the military technology and the organizations, and the motive, resource scarcity, yet choose to remain within their borders. However, several nations and civilizations consciously choose a path of internal intensification and neutrality, prioritizing social stability and sovereign integrity over the spoils of the world. Now, of course, Switzerland is an example, despite whatever their prior past experiences were. The Irish also didn't invade the neighborhood or colonize the faraway lands such as Africa during the Great Famine, also known as the Great Hunger. The Irish potato famine was a period of mass starvation disease that lasted between 1845 and 1852, causing deaths of 1 million, and 1 million fled the country as economic refugees. They possibly could have organized themselves under some kind of an expansionist regime to colonize territories, loot and plunder, but they didn't. So that would always serve an example. Switzerland, I mentioned, which is a modern gold standard for a nation that possesses immense military capability, robust military capability, but it refuses to use it for expansion. The Japan also, despite its earlier history of aggression, colonizer, but the Edo period represents a fascinating 250 years of experiment in the islanders' minimalism, despite having a massive battle-hardened samurai class. So, if you go to the next slide, please, the modern islands of stability, we do have a Nordic models, which is the post-Viking Scandinavia. So, after this Viking age, which was the epitome of foraging into other territories, countries like Norway and Sweden underwent a profound shift. So no matter what happened domestically in terms of scarcity and the other choices they had, but they have lived within their means. Bhutan is a great example, perhaps the closest modern nation to be a minimalist society, and they are obviously they have replaced GDP with GNH. We all know the gross national happiness. They have registered the odds to modernize through aggressive resource extraction or territorial disputes. By limiting tourism and prioritizing environmental conservations, they have chosen to live within the means of their mountains, even at the cost of slower industrial growth. So now I would conclude, this is my final year, and by saying that the historical impulse for foraging, the expansionist seizure of the external resources, carries a profound and often ignored internal price. Beyond the devastation of the colonized, the aggressor suffers a steady erosion of the home culture. So this pursuit necessitates the creation of a massive, often corrupting military-industrial complex that fundamentally reshapes the domestic politics and social priorities. Now, we do not know ceasefire is going to end or not, another few hours to go, but let us see that how we, some of these had imbibed into the policymakers or the warmongers, and what comes to an end. Thank you very much.